The world is in the grip of coronavirus now, as is my throat to a certain extent. The disease has spread from China in a matter of months to around the world, to 177 countries with 340,000 confirmed cases, alongside 14,000 deaths so far, with both numbers growing exponentially as diseases do. However, for some of us this seems familiar. 13 years ago, the world experienced literally another viral disease coming out of China, spreading around the world only to be ultimately defeated. I'm referring to SARS, or the original coronavirus. If coronavirus has been able to succeed on this level, why not SARS 17 years ago? How would having a major pandemic in 2004 affect the years since? How would the world be different? That is the question of this alternate history. We've lived in the century of antibiotics. The last major plague was in 1920 with the Spanish influenza, killing 50 million people total, or slightly less than World War II. Since the discovery of penicillin in 1928, possibly one of the most important inventions in history, plagues have been held at bay. This has been really unusual in world history, in which plagues have been the norm. Our insane overusage of antibiotics for things such as minor illnesses and with livestock has resulted in diseases building an immunity towards them. Coronavirus is a viral disease, and thus not involved in this, but basically all epidemiologists, as well as yours truly, thought that we were seriously overdue for a pandemic. Population growth and crowding create great conditions for disease. The world's population has grown exponentially, and urbanization in the second and third world has created huge poorly sanitized slums that are perfect for the spread of the disease. As the population grows, marginal lands are brought into cultivation in the second and third world, thus bringing humanity into contact with new animal species and thus their diseases. Also, the world is more connected than ever, with globalization and air travel becoming very important in the years after the fall of the Soviet Union. From a purely historical standpoint, we're in a perfect position for a plague. Coronavirus and SARS are actually quite similar, with them both actually being coronaviri, and modern Wuhan coronavirus actually being called SARS-2 since they're both so closely related, sharing 86% of the same genome. They in fact both come from bat populations in the southern half of China. In fact, it's quite possible coronavirus is an evolution of SARS. Many SARS experts were actually quite worried this exact situation would occur, in which SARS would evolve in secret and strike the world again in a new form. So how do we start this alternate history? The primary reason SARS was able to be stopped was its short incubation time of 2 to 7 days, and it wasn't very transmissible outside of hospitals. In our timeline, the authorities were able to stop SARS after it infected 8,000 people for these reasons. A truly cruel way of making this alternate history work would be to have SARS mutate the transmissible symptoms of coronavirus, which can remain dormant while still infectious for between 7 to 21 days, thus making coronavirus practically impossible to stop. Also, diseases don't want to kill their hosts, which is why SARS, with its mortality rate of 10%, mutated to become less dangerous and thus practically out of existence. For this timeline to work, SARS would have to remain deadly and at the same time highly transmissible for long periods of time. So we've basically made a disease here that the authorities wouldn't be able to stop and would spread around the world in a manner similar to coronavirus in recent months. I'd like to make clear I'm not an epidemiologist. My speciality is history, and so I'm just going to give the numbers I've read from authorities, and I can't give much critical commentary. Experts expect the coronavirus to infect between 40 to 70% of the world's population. Let's meet in the middle at 60%. SARS had a fatality rate of 10%, and thus in this world, 6% of the world's population would die. This is pretty good by historic plague standards, but unbelievably horrifying by the modern worlds. Only a few countries suffered casualties higher than this in the Second World War. So in this timeline, the disease does what very infectious diseases normally do. They expand to infect all the people they can and then run out of steam. We still haven't developed the SARS vaccine, and in this world, where they would be working overtime, it would still likely take a year to get into circulation, by which point, due to the modern world's interconnectivity, the disease would have already run its course. The disease would likely kill in the developing world at a higher rate due to the dearth of medical materiel, professionals, and medical literacy. After all of that, the world would be through the worst of the pandemic. The world would be a genuinely different place, transformed politically, culturally, and demographically. Similarly as to with coronavirus, the global financial system would collapse and the 2007 financial crisis would happen 3 years earlier. The issues it created had been building up for a decade, and 2005 and 6 were the worst years of the financial excess in the housing and financial markets, and thus the financial crisis would be more mild. 6% of the world's population doesn't sound big, but the world's population was so huge at 6.3 billion in 2004 that it would mean that 380 million people would die, or roughly equivalent to the US, Canada, Central America, and Cuba combined, or the entirety of Western Europe combined. Also, keep in mind, deaths would be disproportionately in the Third World, which was going through high birth rates and was having exponential population growth. And so if you factor in the children these people would be having, and I'm using an average global growth rate here, it would mean that as of 2020, the world would have 470 million less people in this timeline, with actual numbers being much higher due to disproportionate deaths in the Third World. The butterfly effect would be quite strong with this timeline. With the mass death, the chances that some of the important figures that helped guide the world over the last 20 years would die off in the plague seems very high. It's just, I don't know if that would be Donald Trump, Xi Jinping, Narendra Modi, Tom Hanks, Tina Fey, Lil Pump, but keep in mind that at least a couple of these figures would probably be dead. This would lessen the demand for resources quite a bit. Commodity prices would go down significantly, with the price of oil, wheat, and practically every other kind of resource in serious decline. This would actually give the world economy a strong boost, as with cheaper commodities, the cost of building basically anything would go down. Countries that rely on exporting a single commodity would be screwed. Many countries in the Middle East, such as Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Iran, and Libya, would suddenly experience enormous issues as they would be unable to pay their bills or support their welfare states without oil money. These countries would likely become gripped by unrest and rebellion, likely collapsing into civil war. Remember, in our timeline, one of the main causes of the Arab Spring was drought in the American Midwest, which raised the price of grain. Much of Latin America is like this as well, with basically each country having some crop it's dependent upon, whether coffee in Colombia or Guatemala, bananas in much of Central America, or wheat and cattle in Argentina. It's kind of depressing to read the history because when commodity prices are high, these countries will make progress and build all sorts of buildings and move towards being a democracy, and then when the prices collapse, so do these societies, often having civil wars and strife. And that would be no different in this timeline, with Latin America collapsing into dictatorships after a promising run of democracies, as the more unstable countries would fall into civil war. Meanwhile, countries that rely on food imports would do quite well. Arab countries that don't export oil, such as Yemen or Egypt, are prime members in this category. Egypt would likely escape the Arab Spring in this world. With less population and thus fewer workers, alongside lower commodity prices, would result in a rise in the standard of living. This would combat our timeline's stagnation of wages in the First World, which has resulted in the rise of populism and political radicalism, neither of which would have taken place in this world. The disease would have been deeply traumatizing for the societies involved. Most people in the modern world have no frame of reference for something so scarring. We've been in the era of the greatest peace in world history and have had no major plagues or famines in a very long time. Society would forever rent and would develop in interesting new directions. The main thrust of the US at the time was the War on Terror, with the 9/11 attacks still pretty recent. The US had just invaded Iraq. With the disease killing far more people than the 3,000 in the September 11th attacks, it would quickly change the US's priorities. The US forces would have to temporarily stop their military campaigns in Iraq and Afghanistan due to the disease, and after that had been done, they would be facing a totally different world. The US would also like to withdraw from Iraq earlier, resulting in it becoming an Iranian puppet state while maintaining a token force in Afghanistan. Having to deal with an enormous health crisis would force the United States to recognize the importance of public health. This timeline's version of Obamacare would likely be much more powerful, with the US likely adopting a single-payer system along the lines of Europe or Canada for its healthcare. Say what you want about single-payer systems, the US healthcare system is a god-awful expensive behemoth, and literally any other system would be cheaper. Even if the US adopted an expensive single-payer system, it would still free up enormous amounts of money for the economy. These 13 years of economic drain would not have existed in this world, and the US would be in much better economic shape. Having an enormous plague start in China, which they then lied to the world about and tried to cover up, would tarnish China's image internationally and make China in many ways a pariah state. The US would remove many of its factories from China, moving them either back to the United States or to Mexico. However, China would still likely maintain its economic growth and attract foreign investment, as it would simply be so much cheaper to manufacture things in. China's economic growth would still happen, albeit at a slower pace. People would feel powerless against the grand forces of nature and the world and would distrust science, which did little good to stop the plague. Interest in religion would expand dramatically as people would try to look for an explanation. This would come in two forms. Firstly, an expansion of belief in traditional religion. Secondly, we would see the arrival of new religions. Belief in various New Age belief structures would skyrocket, as would new faiths in general, like Scientology or Falun Gong in our timeline. As the world would become more chaotic, people would turn to conspiracy theories to make reality appear more orderly. The general sense of powerlessness and return of faith in traditional faiths would be bad for ethnic and religious minorities in developing nations. In previous plagues, ethnic minorities have been blamed, and in our world of conspiracy theories in which even the most ridiculous things will be believed, if people want them to, ethnic minorities would be blamed for the disease in much of the developing world. In India and Burma it would be Muslims, in Turkey the Kurds, in Sri Lanka Hindus, and so forth. We would see waves of pogroms and various oppressions. Many countries would create conspiracy theories blaming the United States and the West. Many regimes such as China and Russia would propagate or at least do nothing to deny this. This is already starting in our timeline with coronavirus. The West, and to a greater extent the United States, have been fighting what has amounted to religious wars between the new, what really amounts to a religion of social justice and equity, versus the old belief structures of Christianity and liberalism. Social justice is a profoundly humanistic philosophy, with little room for chaos and random acts of God, or psychological techniques for dealing with mass horror. It would go into rapid decline as the deaths would mount. The culture wars would never have happened in this timeline. However, in a couple decades in the future, we might have seen the New Age religions develop into a coherent philosophy that would be able to counter the dominant Christian liberal culture. Whatifalthist, and thank you for watching. If you enjoyed that content, please like, comment, subscribe, or check out my Patreon. I've got all sorts of cool new maps, and the history of the world will be out soon. So, as always, thank you for watching, and have a great day.